public promise in this story was not vague. It was everywhere, including Lebanon and elsewhere, which means the audience was invited to hear one thing and emotionally process one thing. The region was finally stepping back from the edge. That is the expectation this title is built to destroy. Then came the knife. Lebanon was declared outside the ceasefire because of Hezbollah, which means the word everywhere was already being cut down before most people had even finished hearing it. That is the moment this stopped being a peace story and became a hierarchy story, and the proof arrived immediately. Hours after the ceasefire announcement, dense commercial and residential areas in central Beirut were hit without warning, which means Lebanon was not just excluded in theory. Lebanon was cut loose in practice, on day one, under live fire. If you come here for the version after the spin burns off, hit subscribe now and tell me in the comments whether everywhere was ever real, or whether Lebanon was always the battlefield meant to air. Absorb the exception. The question carrying this whole story is simple and lethal at the same time. Was Lebanon deliberately left outside the ceasefire because that was the price of getting the Iran deal? Or was Lebanon written out in real time once the announcement was already out and somebody needed the deal to sound bigger than it was? That is why people clicked this title, not for another recycled war update, but for the answer to the feeling that something in the wording was rotten from the start. When a ceasefire is sold as regional and one front explodes immediately, the audience does not want a seminar. It wants to know who was protected, who was not, and whether that line was drawn before the first bomb or after it. One family in Beirut lived the entire title in a single night. They stayed awake until 4 a.m. in happiness, went to sleep believing the region might finally be calming down, woke up to hear that Lebanon was not included, and then heard the bombs, while the children were terrified. That is what cut loose means when it reaches a home before it reaches the headlines. That sequence is not just emotionally strong, it is strategically clarifying. First comes the promise, then the exclusion, then the impact when events unfold in that order. The audience stops hearing official language as neutral description and starts hearing it as a tool used to shape expectation before reality catches up. By the later stage of the day's reporting, the violence had become impossible to hide behind careful phrasing. Israel had carried out its heaviest strikes on Lebanon since this phase of the conflict began, and the reported death toll for the day had climbed above 250. That is not a sideshow left humming in the background. That is a major battlefield being used hard, while the word ceasefire is still hanging in the air. So the title's middle blade has to be stated plainly. Israel says no was not a symbolic rejection. It was operational. The no came with missiles attached, and that is why the line matters so much more than the usual diplomatic posturing. People are trained to ignore. In war, words only matter if they survive contact with action. Everywhere did not survive. Not Lebanon did. And the reason the audience feels the violence of that difference is because one phrase created hope, while the other one proved it had conditions. The detail that should stay lodged in the viewer's mind is not a minister at a podium. It is unfinished school homework in the rubble, beside clothing and family photos. Because that is the civilian memory stamp this story leaves behind. If a ceasefire can be announced over your head while your child's homework is still being pulled from debris by nightfall, then whatever was unpaused, it was not your war. That is why the safe version of this story is so useless. The safe version says there was confusion over whether Lebanon was included. But confusion does not capture the asymmetry of what happened. One side had enough clarity to keep moving. Another side, and an entire civilian population, had to discover the meaning of the exception the hard way. Lebanon's own economy minister said the country was getting mixed signals or mixed reports about whether it was part of the ceasefire. That matters because it kills the lazy fallback that only outsiders misunderstood the deal. The uncertainty was official, live, and still unresolved, while Lebanon was already paying the price of it. The minute a government says it is receiving mixed signals during mass violence, Ambiguity stops being an annoying diplomatic detail. It becomes a battlefield condition. It creates a zone where one actor can impose reality faster than everyone else can define it. This is where the story begins to widen, because the issue is no longer just whether the negotiators were sloppy, dishonest, or divided. The issue is whether the contradiction itself was useful. Useful to Israel because it preserved room to keep hitting Hezbollah. Useful to Washington because it let the Iran ceasefire stand without requiring a full regional freeze. Useful to every official who wanted the headline of de-escalation without swallowing all the military costs of it. The intelligence picture makes that contradiction harder, not softer. Senior US and Israeli officials were saying the Lebanon campaign was outside the ceasefire, while Hezbollah officials were saying they had been informed that they were part of a. That means the fracture was not sitting in theory. It was sitting in the operational expectations of the actors most likely to escalate next. That matters because a ceasefire does not break only when someone says it is over. A ceasefire can be hollow from birth if the parties are moving under different assumptions about what was actually frozen. And once that happens, the most dangerous actor is not just the one firing. It is the actor that still has room to define the map, while everyone else is discovering where the borders really are. If Hezbollah slows because it thinks Lebanon is covered, and Israel strikes because it knows Lebanon is not covered, ambiguity stops being neutral. It becomes leverage. It gives one side the advantage of movement while the other side is still trapped inside a sentence. Then came the cleanup line from Washington. Iran thought Lebanon was included, but it just wasn't, and that promise was never made. Maybe that is the truth, but if it is, then this was a misunderstanding enormous enough to survive a public everywhere announcement, to distort the expectations of multiple actors, and to leave a country standing under the consequences before the wording was fully clarified. And if that is not the truth, then the word misunderstanding is doing political labor. It turns a violent contradiction into an administrative glitch. It strips intention out of an outcome that was anything but harmless, and it asks the audience to treat what looked like a loophole as if it were just a translation problem. This is the point where the video has to go one layer deeper than the articles. There are really only two coherent possibilities here. Either Lebanon was excluded by design from the start, because that was the only way Israel and Washington were willing to let the Iran track cool down, or the deal was publicly framed more broadly than the actual military intentions behind it, which means the headline of peace outran the real map of restraint. And those two possibilities are different in one way but identical in another. If Lebanon was deliberately excluded, then the ceasefire was never everywhere in any honest sense. If Lebanon was effectively written out after the announcement, then the ceasefire was incoherent at the exact point where civilians most needed clarity. In both cases, the public heard a bigger piece than the one Lebanon actually got. That is why the scene in Beirut matters so much. Black smoke rose over the city while explosions cut through the ordinary sound of a blue sky afternoon, which means this was not some remote continuation of a border exchange hidden from a daily life. The war was visibly asserting itself inside the urban normality that a real ceasefire is supposed to begin restoring. And once the capital sounds like that, every reassurance becomes suspect. Families do not return home. Diplomatic language no longer calms anyone. The audience can feel in its gut that the deal may still exist on paper, but Lebanon has already learned where the paper ends. This also explains why the phrase separate skirmish feels so insulting to anyone actually tracking the event. A separate skirmish does not dominate the emotional logic of day one. A separate skirmish does not force a whole title into existence. A separate skirmish does not make people wonder whether the word ceasefire was built with a trapdoor in it. For Israel, the value of that trapdoor is obvious. A pause on the Iran front lowers one kind of strategic pressure. Leaving Lebanon open preserves another kind of pressure against Hezbollah, preserves domestic optics that the northern threat is still being hit, and avoids looking as if the war stopped short while unresolved military aims remain. For Washington, the value is different but related. A narrower ceasefire is easier to defend if the goal is to stabilize the US-Iran track without taking ownership of every other active battlefield in the region. That means you get the language of de-escalation where you most need it, while treating the rest as separate complications rather than central contradictions. But that compartmentalization was never stable. The warning from the UN was direct. Ongoing military activity in Lebanon posed a grave risk to the ceasefire and to any lasting regional peace. That means the front left outside the deal was also the front most capable of contaminating the entire peace process. This is the paradox at the center of the story. The loophole that makes a ceasefire easier to announce can be the same loophole that makes it harder to survive. If one battlefield is left burning because it is politically useful, that fire does not stay obedient just because officials keep insisting it is separate. And that is exactly where Hezbollah and Iran get their leverage back. If they can argue that Lebanon was supposed to be inside the de-escalation space, then every Israeli strike becomes evidence that the ceasefire is already compromised. If they cannot prove that, they can still use Lebanon to expose the moral hollowness of the broader peace language being sold to the world. Either way, Lebanon becomes the test case, not the background noise, not the side file the test case, the place where everyone gets to see whether this was a genuine step back from war, or a rearrangement of war with one front left exposed so the others could be managed. The humanitarian reading of the day arrived fast and without euphemism. The scale of the killing and destruction was described as nothing short of horrific, which matters because it strips away the fantasy that this was merely technical. Spillover beneath a bigger peace. The civilian reality was too severe, too immediate, and too visible for that kind of polite framing to hold. And once civilian reality becomes that undeniable, the information war changes shape. The argument is no longer only about what the negotiators intended. It becomes about who benefited from the ambiguity, who maintained freedom of action inside it, and who was expected to absorb the cost without blowing up the headline. This is why the audience instinct on the title is so strong. People hear ceasefire everywhere and then watch Lebanon burn, and they immediately sense that the hidden story is not a misunderstanding in the ordinary sense. The hidden story is prioritization. Which wars had to cool? Which wars could keep burning? Which populations counted as protected first? That is why the split screen of the day is so revealing. On one side, official language was already talking about a broader peace agreement and a ceasefire taking hold. On the other side, Lebanon was living inside the consequences of being left outside that peace language. The contrast is not background decoration. The contrast is the architecture of the event. Broader for whom? Peace over which map? Calm purchased by sacrificing which front first? Those are the questions the audience actually clicked for, because those are the questions no clean press statement can answer without exposing what the deal really was. And once you ask those questions, the title pays off in full emotional terms. Lebanon gets cut loose on day one does not mean Lebanon was forgotten by accident. It means that when the region was invited to exhale, Lebanon discovered that the exhale had borders. Now bring the two truths together and finish this cleanly. If Lebanon was knowingly excluded from the start, then the ceasefire was never what it sounded like. It was a narrower bargain, wrapped in wider language, and Lebanon was the battlefield sacrificed to make it politically marketable. If Lebanon was not supposed to be excluded, and the meaning was narrowed or denied after the announcement, then the failure is even worse. Then the deal was born with a fracture inside it, and that fracture surfaced in the most brutal way possible. Not in a memo, not in a follow-up briefing, but in bombs falling on day one before the public meaning of the ceasefire had even stabilized. Either way, one conclusion survives every attempt to soften it. The word ceasefire did not mean the same thing to everyone involved, and the first place where that difference became visible was Lebanon. That is the hard, memorable conclusion the viewer should leave with. Some fires were important enough to pause. One fire was useful enough to leave burning. And once the audience sees that hierarchy, every future claim of regional peace will sound a lot less innocent. Go back to that family, awake until 4 a.m. Go back to the children hearing bombs after the promise of calm. Go back to the unfinished homework in the rubble. Those are not side details added for emotion. They are the final proof that the story was never about wording alone. It was about who learned by morning that everywhere did not include them. That is why this title is not clickbait. It is an indictment. Everywhere was the promise. No was the correction. Lebanon was the cost. Stay with this channel if you want the layer of the story that only becomes visible after the official version starts cracking.